Well, you've probably realized by now that I'm quite enthusiastic about the use of VR as a research method, but it's important to realize that VR is not the best method for answering all sorts of research questions, right? It really depends on your research question, which method should be best used to answer it. And there are all sorts of research fields where perhaps virtual reality is not the right method to pick. There might be way better methods to use if you want to tackle a question, if you want to find an answer to your question. One example of a research field in which I think virtual reality is typically not the right method to be used is, for instance, the study of reading. So now imagine you want to find out what sort of happens in people's brains, what happens in their mind, what kind of cognitive processes take place in their head while they're reading, for instance, while they're reading a book or when they're reading a text on the internet. I can't really think of a reason why, for instance, to answer those kind of questions, you would need virtual reality. Because typically people are not reading in very super rich environments, right? When they're reading, for instance, they might have a book in front of them and really focus only on this book. There's no interaction with other people typically. If they're reading a website text, for instance, they're reading a website text in 2D on a computer screen. So perhaps in that case, it's much better to use a computer paradigm to study reading compared to using VR and place participants in like a super large, rich, dynamic environment, because simply when they're reading in everyday life, that's also not what the situations look like when they're reading most of the time. Right, so always think about what method could be best used to answer your research question. But still, actually, even in the field of reading research, people now are actually using virtual reality. So they place participants in a virtual environment. Participants wear a head-mounted display that allows for tracking people's eye movements, and then text is presented in virtual reality. So it looks like this, for instance, you wear this headset, and then this is what you see. You see written words in front of you. And actually what those authors observed is that actually even in this field of reading research, there is an example of an advantage of using VR, namely that there are no external perturbations. So actually when participants are in this virtual world, that completely blocks the real world. This sort of also leads to a situation where they're not really distracted. So they don't see the larger room that they're sitting in. They're just focusing on this text. And therefore, perhaps the data that are collected like this in those kind of environments, the eye tracking data in this case, might have not as much noise in the data compared to traditional paradigms, where participants are sitting in a lab and perhaps they're distracted by all sorts of visual aspects in that lab. Well, this is sort of something you can avoid by using VR in this case. But I would say this is a very exceptional situation. So in general, I think really think about the phenomenon that you're interested in and whether or not VR is the right method to use. And in some cases, it simply isn't. And that's perfectly fine. So especially if you're interested in sort of generalizing your theories to rich everyday phenomena, then VR can be very useful because it allows you to create very rich situations. If you're not interested in that, because your research question doesn't focus on that, then perhaps a different method is best.